In the previous video, we tried to look at the frequentist intuition on independence of two random variables, and now let's look at the slightly more complicated and perhaps also counterintuitive idea of conditional independence between variables. And the reason I'm saying it's counterintuitive is because if we look at kind of like one of the classic situations of three variables in a Bayes net, then we say that these variables here are conditionally independent, conditioned on this variable up here, but they're not independent per se. And similarly, for the other kind of classic situation of having a chain of variables or a Markov chain, so we say that these two variables are obviously not independent, but they're conditionally independent, conditioned on the variable in between. And let's see what this means if we look at the joint probability distributions. We look at the classic example of a person having a cavity, and this cavity causes pain, so toothache, and also causes the dentist to catch with some probability. So there's a probability of having a cavity, and given that you have a cavity, increase your probability to have pain, and also increase the probability to have catch, to have the tool of the dentist catch on your tooth. And we say that these two variables are not independent, but they are conditionally independent, conditioned on the cavity. So let's go back to our joint probability distribution and fill out some values to try and explain what we mean about the joint probability distribution. I'm going to repeat this again. This structure here does not talk about causality. It looks like causality, but it really talks about our assumptions about how the joint probability distribution is distributed, is laid out, how this particular joint probability distribution is doesn't have the full 7 degrees of information, 7 degrees of freedom of information in it. So here we have the joint probability distribution, and we have 8 numbers, and we're going to look. So this corner here would be the probability of somebody being in pain, the tooth tool was catching on the tooth, and they do have a cavity. So this is probably going to be a lot of frequency in this particular area. So let's actually draw 2 different views of the same cube. Now you can see this is the full joint probability distribution. Here we're kind of looking through it, ignoring the cavity. We're kind of seeing all the cavities and not cavities together, and the same is happening here. And here we sort of split it up. We split the cube up into 2 slices, and this is the back of the cube, the not cavity slice. This is the front of the cube, the cavity slice. And let's fill those out with some sort of frequencies or some populations to indicate the probability distribution, the joint probability distribution between these 3 variables. So we'll have a lot of people in here who don't have a cavity, don't have pain, and the tooth tool did not catch. We'll put like a big blob here. And then there's going to be almost nobody who will not have a cavity but have the tooth catch and have no pain. So it's a few people, but not too many. And then there's also going to be not many people who don't have a cavity and will be in pain. They could be in pain for some other reasons, or maybe a little more than tooth tool catching. And finally, there's going to be pretty much nobody, very minuscule amount of people, who will not have a cavity but will have both pain and the dentist tool catching. And then we have the opposite situation here for people who have a cavity. A lot of people are going to have a cavity and be in pain, and then fewer people are going to have a cavity and not have any pain, but the dentist tool still catches, and then also a fewer amount of people will be in the opposite situation, and again very few people will be in the situation where they have a cavity but they have no pain and the dentist tool does not catch. So this is the full joint probability distribution split up into both cases of the variable for cavity. At this point, let's look at this representation here. And what this representation is supposed to show is if we don't know anything about the cavity situation, we're kind of mixing these joint probabilities together into a single joint probability of just these two variables. So we're summing over this variable and creating just a joint probability over two variables. So let's do that. So we have all this big chunk of people here, and smaller chunk here, and smaller, and very small down here. And the opposite is true for the red one, so smaller and smaller and minuscule. So if we just look at these two variables, we can see that they're not independent, meaning that they're correlated. You can see it that way. Or if we look at any of these rows, the probability distribution of these two together. So now we can imagine we're kind of looking through this and seeing both the front and the back mixed together. And if we look at the top row of pain, we can see the distribution of catch. It's more likely that people at their dentist too will catch than not. And if you look at the people who don't have pain, it's more likely that dentist too will not catch. And the same goes if you look at just this column or just this column. So this means that these two variables are not independent. But if we know that a person has a cavity or doesn't have a cavity, now we can see that in this case, the probability distribution, we can see them as being the same. So maybe I didn't draw it very precisely, but you can see that given the cavity, if we look just at the relationship between pain and catch, you can see that whether I am in pain, there's a higher probability of catching and not catching, and whether I'm not in pain, there's a low probability overall, but still it's a high probability of catching with the tool and not catching. And the same goes in this direction. So once I know whether I have a cavity, once I look at just one slice out of the two, these two variables now are independent, and the same happens here. So another way to think about it is that the cavity really explains why there's such a big amount of people here and less here and less here and very little here. So knowing the cavity, these variables suddenly become independent because just picking the right slice really explains the distribution in each of these directions. But if I don't know the cavity, variable, then looking over all the possibilities of cavity, these variables are independent. And this is kind of what this diagram here means. This diagram means, and sometimes it's called that the cavity is explaining away the dependence between the variables. The variables are dependent, but they're only dependent because of the cavity. And once you look at the cavity separately, suddenly they become independent. So the cavity, the choice of the slice, is really what creates all the effect that we're seeing in the joint probability distribution. And again, if you want to formalize this, we can say that the probability of being in pain given the cavity and the catch is equal to the probability of being in pain just given the cavity. Because everything we know about the relationship between pain and catching is because of this other variable cavity. And this is what gets us all the savings when we do Bayesian inference, and we have this situation here between two variables that explains away the independence between these two variables. And this also kind of gives us a hint on why Bayesian inference in a Bayes net works more efficiently, because Bayesian inference and Bayesian, when you look at variable elimination and any of these techniques, what they really do is they slice up joint probability distribution and sum them up in other cases. So when we have evidence, when we know about a variable, we can slice up part of the probability distribution, and then we get a small probability distribution that is independent, which then gives us the saving in variables when we try to compute the full joint probability distribution. So while these two variables without evidence might not be independent, we would have to sort of look at all of each one of those four values in the joint probability distribution. If we have evidence that can explain away the relationship between these two variables, that means that we can slice up a part of it and then get a non-independent, get an independent probability distribution, which then gives us those savings in degrees of freedom that enable us to do faster calculations.